And that's something that I had already given a good deal of thought to, distinguishing the ill person from the patient. The patient is one who is spoken for by professionals and who systematically does not have a voice. At most, they answer scripted questions. The ill person is one who's really off the medical radar and who very much has a voice. And I was experienced myself in my own critical illnesses. And then as I spent time in support groups and just talking to a lot of people about predominantly cancer, but other illnesses as well, um, what might be called the hidden life of the ill person.
Mm.
That gets at your theme of invisibility.
Mm.
The ways in which the medical establishment, institutional medicine, as I would call it, is really unaware of this whole other life of ill people reflecting themselves and reflecting together in various venues on what it means to be ill. And in Anatole Broyard's great phrase, examining their physicians and thinking of the examination as being much more mutual than professional medicine is often comfortable understanding it to be. So this whole question of how do we give voice to ill people themselves, and how do ill people disentangle their voices from the chatter of medical voices, family voices, popular culture voices, all the other voices that are telling them what their experience ought to be in the version of that particular voice.
And this is very much at the heart of the field. And also at the same time, it's a much broader inquiry, always with narrative at the core, into how can such attentiveness to narrative illuminate issues pertaining to not just clinical practice, but also experiences of illness and disability, um, and in a broader sense. And so that's where my own work comes in, most notably my recent book, well, my most recent book, Metanosis,
Yes.
came out in 2021 with Oxford Revelatory Narratives of Health and Identity, which will be, I believe, our focus for today. And this is a topic where narrative is still at the core, and in particular, I'm looking at this phenomenon of a belated diagnosis of a longstanding condition, or a realization that one has what could be considered to be a condition.
Mm.
And we'll talk about, I hope, the different ways in which I enter into this topic with thinking about narrative as the through line. But just to get us started, the way that I define this condition, this phenomenon of metanosis, is that it can happen either because you have the diagnosis of a condition that's longstanding and was simply never detected before. So this happened to me. We realized in mid-adulthood that I have a big visual field, quote unquote, defect. And very straightforwardly, if it had been tested for when I was younger, they would have found it. It's very obvious. But the other set of experiences that people have are when the diagnostic parameters themselves have shifted. So increasingly, you see adults who realize that they might consider to have, quote unquote, autism spectrum disorder or attention deficit, quote unquote, disorder. And the project is looking at people who've had these experiences in a number of different domains and thinking about what are some of the common aspects of that experience? How can narrative inquiry illuminate that experience? How can we help people to have more tools to express what they're going through and to empower people who have this experience, as well as the people around them?
It's a proper claim to telling one's own story. The other side of it is, as a sociologist, as somebody who's done versions of sociolinguistics, as somebody who's read a lot about narrative, none of us ever tell our own story. No story is ever properly our own because we're always assembling our stories out of the detritus of all of the stories that we have heard that have come to us in multiple ways. Um, we need the formulaic plots, we need the metaphors, we need the character types, we need the expectations of narrative progression um, that come with certain types of stories. We need them in order to put the story together ourselves. To be able to tell it, we have to have these resources. And we need to use these resources so that our listeners will find the story intelligible.
So I just wanted to hear a little bit more about your thinking around that idea of the communal and the intelligibility of stories.
Well, I mean, that was one of the things that drew me to write more about this metanosis topic, because I experienced it myself, and I was really curious. I at the time when my visual field defect was diagnosed, I found it very difficult to speak about it with people in my life, and um, but I was intrigued by that. I thought, what
Yeah.
is the source of this narrative? Like, what makes it difficult for this to be something that can be, how could, and I don't know, I don't think I really achieved the kind of recognition that I sought in that situation, but I plunged into the topic because I was interested in why it was that it wasn't mapping on. And I think that, um, I found some answers in understanding better what the dominant cultural narratives are related to illness and disability. And so, for example, my colleague, well, I've collaborated with him, Arthur Frank, who's done some really essential work, pioneering work vis-a-vis illness narratives, um, talks about there being these three typologies of illness narratives. A restitution, in which you become as good as new, or quest, which is illness understood as a journey, or chaos, which is kind of self-explanatory. And to his credit, he sets he doesn't, these are not prescriptive. He really sets them forward as descriptive, but also to illuminate cases wherein experience does not map onto these prescriptive cultural narratives. And the one that he talks about initially, because also he experienced it himself, is what he calls the remission society, so being in remission from cancer. And chronic illness also doesn't map onto any of these, because you're not as good as new again. And so I think that there are times where illuminating what the dominant narrative scripts are in a particular culture can be helpful, because then it gives you a language and in order to describe the ways in which experience is not described by any of those. And I'm also thinking about the importance of not falling into the trap of saying, oh, you don't have this narrative intelligibility, therefore we just need to create a new one.
Yeah.
I mean, in a sense, I've done that paradoxically, because I named this phenomenon that otherwise escaped, and I think it has been helpful to people. That said, though, I think ultimately it's more beneficial if we all have more of a sense that our experience cannot be contained more often than not within these scripts, and to just have a greater um, spirit of grace and generosity around that. Because, also, as you're talking about the experience of chronic illness, I know that for many people too, one could be in one state and then that changes. You could need accommodations this week and then not the next. And it's very hard, that kind of lack of apparent consistency is not amenable to a system that wants to simply categorize individuals and label them for better or for worse. But if we had a more dynamic understanding that well, actually change is the norm. Like, we're always changing all the time, and some people's needs might fluctuate more than others.
Yeah.
And that's not an exception, that's actually to be expected. But when you're the individual in that situation, you are the problem, and it's only you. And if you want to draw attention to the kind of violence that's being enacted by the system, the system is anonymous, the system is just the system. That's just the efficient way that we do things. How, but that's not a new problem. I mean, that's the nature of the condition that we've created for ourselves.
Yeah, I think there is something about that, the need for, I think, coming back to those ideas of tools and language and vocabulary that allow people to navigate. I mean, I think you navigate instantly, right? I don't think you ever get healed, even if you've had a serious something and you've recovered, but you're always living with it, right? So you kind of, it's that navigating of the self and community at the same time.
Yeah, I love that. I love that term. And I think it's very apt here because even is in all the cases that we're talking about from that the premise here for me is that even if you quote unquote get the diagnosis, that and whether that's good or bad or good and bad at the same time or good now and bad later or whatever the case may be, is that you want to empower people to understand themselves as navigating that knowledge in the context of everything in their lives, and that can change. And so you're not defined by it like, oh, well, you're bipolar, therefore you are,
Yeah.
I mean, you can still give credibility to that diagnosis and gain insight from it while also understanding that it's something that you are going to be navigating and negotiating with. It's one part of your lived experience, right?
My thinking still goes back to a culture of face-to-face contacts and print materials, and it needs to be reimagined by people who've spent their lives thinking in much more visual electronic media, and whose notion of the mediations of interaction are very different than I'm able to entertain. So if as an old man I can suggest some fundamental problems, I look forward to younger people taking these up and thinking of them in ways in which I'm afraid I become increasingly unable.
I'll just throw this out there because I just send my good wishes and greetings to anybody who is watching or listening to this, and say that if you're interested in, if you feel drawn to this question of how we can try to work toward better narrative understandings and empower ourselves, that I feel hopeful in the sense that I think there are a lot of people who are drawn to this and who there's a growing awareness that we need to do this work. And so welcome you to keep searching and connecting with other people, because I think that we have made progress and there's a lot more to be done.